The gospel lesson is from the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 16, verses 1 through 13. Jesus then said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is this I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' Then the manager said to himself, 'What will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I've decided what I will do so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes.' So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil. He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, 'How much do you owe?' And he replied, 100 containers of wheat. He said to him, 'Take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it's gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in very little is dishonest also in much. If then you've not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." Here ends the reading. So one commentator wrote about this parable from Luke's gospel that we have lots of great artwork and stained glass windows of sheep being found and people being returned home. But he says, "I've never seen a window depicting a man with a sly look saying to another, 'Falsify the bill, make it less than it really is.'" So this parable, the parable of the dishonest manager, is weird. And the only thing the vast majority of Christians throughout history have agreed upon is that we shouldn't take it as license to steal from our employers. So sorry if any of you were starting to get some bold plans for Monday. But besides Jesus doesn't want us to steal from people, there's very little consensus, ancient or modern, about what this parable means and what we should make of it. So we're going to go through the parable and some common attempts people have used to make sense of it, and then we'll kind of go for some things that I think we can take away from it. So the parable's only in Luke, and it seems to kick off a series of teaching on money. Later on in the chapter, Luke notes that the listening Pharisees were lovers of money, so money is definitely a thing involved with the parable somehow. Now in it, there's a rich man who's told his manager was squandering the property entrusted to him. Now this could either mean the manager was engaged in dishonest business practices, or that he was simply bad at his job and was wasting away the property under his stewardship. So the rich man confronts his manager and asks for an account of all the property and says the manager's going to be fired. So the manager has now been told he's going to be fired, but he's still currently employed, and he starts thinking about his future employment prospects. I find it kind of funny how he rules out options. He's like, I'm not strong enough to dig and I'm too proud to beg. So he decides that manual labor and begging are off the table. So he decides to use the time left as an employee of the rich man to start winning himself some favors. Perhaps this was a strategic error on the part of the rich man to leave this guy in charge after telling him he was going to be fired. So anyway, the manager goes to the people who owe his master debts. And he goes up to the first guy and asks, "How much do you owe my master?" And that guy says, 100 jugs of olive oil. And the manager replies, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. The manager then asks the next guy, and that guy's bill is reduced from 100 containers of wheat to 80. Now, a few things before we get any further. First, I don't know any debt collector or business arrangement where the party who is owed money asks you how much you owe. Like, the student loan companies never asked me how much money I owed. They always just told me. Like, it was their business to know how much money I owed them. So it seems very odd that the manager asks these people what they owe the master. He, as the manager, should be keeping track of what they owe. So it is possible that this is related to why he was fired. So other things to note. So the amounts of olive oil and grain of these debts are likely mean that these debts are likely business related. Like, the olive oil comes out to probably somewhere around like 900 gallons of olive oil, which is more than your average family is going to be going through. And there's not consensus among scholars on how big the unit of grain used in the parable is, but people peg it between 6.5 and 12 bushels. So again, that's a very large amount of grain if you multiply it out by 100. So lots of people think these are the sorts of amounts for merchants and other commercial enterprises. So these details about the amounts are what convinced me that this parable isn't about forgiving poor people's like unjust predatory debts, because it seems like these are all rich people doing deals with each other. So there are scholars who disagree with me, but I am not convinced. So that's one option about what this parable could mean, knocked out. So with that option gone, there are kind of three common ways people try to interpret the manager's conduct. So one way people try and fix the parable is saying the manager was only reducing these debts to knock off the interest, which would put him in accordance with the commandments that prohibit usury or predatory lending. However, the issue with this option is that the interest rates for the grain and olive oil are much different, and that would mean the interest rate on the olive oil was 100%, which I think is higher than even a loan shark would charge. So I'm not convinced that the manager is just cutting down interest rates. Now, another option people suggest is that the manager was merely removing his commission from these transactions. And I'm unconvinced by this argument, because if the manager was getting 100% commission on olive oil, where on earth is the rich man making any money off of these transactions? And again, why would the commission be so much different on olive oil versus grain? So the only option I think makes sense is to take this parable at face value and assume that the manager's actions were indeed cheating his boss. The other options to me feel like they take too many mental gymnastics, and I'm pretty sure if details like interest rates or commissions were vital to the parable, Jesus would have mentioned them. So we've got a manager who defrauds his boss, and then his boss commends him for his shrewdness and says, "For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light." And Jesus goes on to say, "And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it's gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes." And then Jesus goes on to talk about being faithful with little things given to us, and that one cannot serve God and wealth. Now, for the parable itself, without those concluding verses of teaching, I think there are kind of two true observations in it. The manager does act shrewdly to secure his future. Now, we shouldn't seek to imitate him, but I think his boss rightly points out that the manager made a good play with the resources he had available to him. It reminds me of a story a friend told me. One of their friends was called to a church with a parsonage, and the church told him they'd pay the first 6 months of utilities, and after that they'd only pay what the average amount was for those 6 months. So this person responded by using as much electricity and heat and water during those 6 months as they possibly could, so that the next months of normal usage would be within the average. Now, was that ethical? Probably not. Was it shrewd? Yeah, it was shrewd. So the line about the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the children of light, that's also a true observation. So children of light here would be people who hear and believe the gospel, and children of this generation or children of the world, that's just kind of a stand-in phrase for worldly people, people who are unconcerned with following the gospel. Now, on some levels, this verse is saying nice guys finish last, which of course isn't always true. But often when people who behave ethically are working with those who are unethical, they're playing by completely different sets of rules, and unethical people can get away with a lot. I was watching an interview with a man who worked in the White House Government Ethics Office for the 3 presidents before President Biden, and he noted that the whole system is set up assuming that the president himself and other parts of the government care about ethics. The whole system is woefully unequipped to rein in bad behavior if the president or administration or parts of the government don't actually care about or intend to be ethical. The children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the children of light. So I think on one level, this aspect of the parable is meant to remind Jesus' followers to be a bit shrewd so they don't get taken advantage of. It seems to be similar where Jesus says in Matthew, "See, I am sending you out like sheep into the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves." There's a sense of Jesus telling people to hold to the teachings and hope of the gospel, but to remember that the world isn't as kind and ethical as it should be. So after that, Jesus says, "Make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes." Now, I think this line is good news for us, but you have to make an assumption about what dishonest wealth means. Now, on the surface, dishonest wealth would mean stolen or scammed money, and then this line doesn't help us very much. But that word dishonest can also be unrighteous, which is a bit broader in meaning, and I'm going to go with that idea, plus what Jesus says about not being able to serve God and wealth, to say that essentially all of our wealth is unrighteous wealth. So the way the world economy operates causes us and everyone else in the world to often value things like money, profit, personal gain, and property over the well-being of actual people. Much, if not all, of our first world Western lifestyle is supported by profound sacrifices and terrible conditions for people in other parts of the world. Companies who produce our food and goods sometimes make most decisions based on the bottom line rather than what's best for workers, for the planet, or even for the overall health and well-being of people who consume their products and live near their facilities. All of our wealth, regardless of how we earned it or how much we have, is part of this unrighteous system. We are all participants, whether we want to be, and we should all hold our material possessions and money loosely, because holding tightly to wealth and valuing it causes us to devalue the people and creation God loves. So the good news is that if all of our wealth is unrighteous wealth, then the line "make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth" or unrighteous wealth makes more sense. Essentially, the meaning would be, use the wealth you have to invest in what matters, invest in what lasts. And relationships are the most important things and lasting things that we can invest in. Our friends, our families, the people we encounter, those are all far more precious than our wealth. We can't take wealth with us, but investing in loving our neighbors with our time and our money is storing up treasure in heaven, our eternal home. Now, as for the manager, he should not have defrauded his boss, but he did very clearly understand what mattered most was relationships with other people. Now, are relationships based on defrauding your boss ideal? No. But this is why people have been confused about this parable for millennia. But if we jump back to storing up treasure in heaven and investing in what lasts, the other piece of good news for us on that front is related to the verse towards the end, where Jesus says, "Whoever is faithful in very little is faithful also in much." This is a reminder that our small acts of fidelity and faithfulness and honesty are just as important as those big moments for helping us invest in what matters. Scholar Fred Craddock writes, "Most of us will not this week christen a ship, write a book, end a war, appoint a cabinet, dine with a queen, convert a nation, or be burned at the stake. Most likely the week will present no more than a chance to give a cup of water, write a note, visit a nursing home, vote for county commissioner, teach a Sunday school class, share a meal, tell a child a story, go to choir practice, and feed the neighbor's cat. Whoever is faithful in very little is faithful also in much. So overall, I believe this parable is naming the difficulty of living faithfully in a world that often means we have to operate within unrighteous systems. And in the midst of that, we're called to use what we have to invest in relationships with people, lasting things. And we're reminded that in the middle of muddling through life in this world, all our small acts matter. They matter to the people around us, and they matter to God. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus calls the church to be salt and light. And with both those things, a little bit goes a long way. So when we invest in relationships that matter, when we stick to being faithful with the little acts of our everyday lives, God through us shines a light into the darkness. And those little things are what change the world for the better. Amen.